Tropic Thunder movie review. So this is a movie that has a lot of famous comedians in it. Well, a lot of famous actors, most of whom are comedians. Now, some of the people in this movie are kind of in disguise under heavy makeup or surprise cameos. So even just kind of revealing the list of actors in here is a little bit of a spoiler. Fair warning, I'm going to get into it with the spoilers here. It's got Ben Stiller in it, Robert Downey Jr., Jack Black, Nick Nolte, Matthew McConaughey, and then Tom Cruise, of course, under all that makeup, playing like the bald Hollywood guy with the bald cap on, which, like a lot of people, I did not realize that was Tom Cruise when I was first watching this movie. I forget exactly when it dawned on me. But I think this is quite a common experience when you're watching this movie, right? You see that character, you think, okay, he looks vaguely familiar. Where have I seen him before? It's kind of in the back of your mind, and all of a sudden at a certain point, it's just like, that's Tom Cruise. It was quite clever the way they did it and the way they resisted marketing that cameo. And also Steve Coogan. Steve Coogan, hopefully I'm pronouncing that name right, is not very famous in America, but he's a famous British comedian. When I was living abroad, one of my British friends introduced me to Alan Partridge. Alan Partridge is the main character Steve Coogan did on a British TV show, and it was quite popular in Britain. So whenever I see Steve Coogan on an American movie, I'm like, I know who that is. And interestingly enough, Steve Coogan actually starts off as pretty much the main character in this movie until it gets kind of blown up about, I don't remember, not quite halfway through. It's still kind of in the beginning he gets blown up, but the problems his character is facing is the main kind of arc of the movie until he just gets blown up out of nowhere. And yeah, if you watch the director's commentary of this movie, they also comment on the fact that he was pretty much the main character and then they just blew him up. Anyways, with a film with this many funny people in it, you'd be expecting something pretty spectacular. I had a coworker who saw this movie before I did. I asked him, you know, what did you think of it? And he said, oh, I don't know, man. He said, with all the big name comics they had in that film, I expected it to be a lot funnier than it was. I mean, it's okay, it's worth watching, but it's not near as funny as it should have been. And yeah, come to that, it's probably not nearly as funny as it should have been. But, you know, I think with comedy maybe, less can be more, right? So there's a temptation to think the more comedians you stuff into a movie, the funnier it would be. And not just modern movies, but old movies have made this mistake as well, right? Think of something like Around the World in 80 Days, or It's a Mad, Mad World, or something like that. These old movies where they just stuffed all the comedians into them. But like, comedians need room to breathe and develop characters and kind of set up jokes. And sometimes if you've got just one comedian in a movie and you give them people to play off of, you know, the straight men, and you give them like funny situations, that can be a lot funnier than if you cram 5 really good comedians into a movie. And I think maybe that's why this movie went a little bit wrong, is it had too many funny people crammed into it and not enough space to develop the character arcs or comedic potentials of any one of them. That being said, there are some funny scenes in this movie. It's essentially a parody of Vietnam War movies like Platoon, which takes place within as a kind of a making of the movie. So the characters are playing actors who are making a Vietnam War movie. So right from the beginning of the movie, we get a scene where Ben Stiller is playing a character who has both of his arms blown off. And he's trying to cry in the scene, but he's playing opposite Robert Downey Jr. And Robert Downey Jr. starts crying first. And Ben Stiller is so upset by this that he can't bring himself to cry. which leads to an argument between them about who's supposed to be crying, and then the hapless director, Steve Coogan, and it ends with Robert Downey Jr. walking off the set and ruining an expensive special effects scene. No, you can't tell me that's not funny. That was a funny scene. Although, to be honest, it was funnier the second time I watched the movie. The reason being is that the rivalry between Ben Stiller and Robert Downey Jr. And the fact that Ben Stiller's character feels very intimidated by Robert Downey Jr., that's not established until later in the movie. I don't know. Maybe this is an example where the movie could have done with some better editing of kind of establishing this stuff first before trying to melt comedy out of it. So there is a lot of character arcs. There is a convoluted plot, which makes it a little bit difficult maybe for this movie to be as funny as it should be. But it was, I wouldn't say it was not funny. I got a few chuckles out of it. Okay. So, and besides which, I think a comedy where you're kind of laughing nonstop from beginning to end is pretty rare anyways, right? If you get a couple good laughs out of a film, that's usually good enough. Okay, so that's the end of the review proper. There are a couple controversies in this movie that I'll just try and address briefly. First one was Robert Downey Jr. in blackface, which some people got offended at. I have the feeling maybe if this movie came out now, it would be a bigger controversy now than it was 10 years ago, because I think this is one of the things where the cultural sensitivity has increased in recent years. But even back then, it was somewhat of an issue. I'm willing to largely give it a pass because the fact that it was wildly inappropriate was kind of the whole joke. So, the whole thing was supposed to be a commentary on why it's inappropriate for a white character to do blackface. Some people even then felt it was a little bit offensive, and, this is one of those things where there's no right answer. It's a judgment call. For me, I didn't have a big problem with it. I thought it was addressed within the context of the movie. And I think most people didn't have a big problem with it for that exact same reason. A thing that got slightly more press was the word retard being used in this movie. And again, it is one of those things where, even within the context of the movie, they're not endorsing it, right? First of all, they're making fun of Hollywood's portrayal of mentally impaired people. So it's a satire on how these people are portrayed in Hollywood. And then secondly, I thought even within the context of the movie, the word retard was supposed to be... You weren't supposed to feel like it was cool. You were supposed to feel like it was a bit crass that the characters were using that word. I did get a comment on my original review about this from somebody who was the mother of a special needs child, and she felt that the movie was very insensitive. Apparently, she said that in the marketing for the movie, they used the word retard. Like, once upon a time, there was a retard, was a tagline in one of the ads. I was oblivious to this because I had been living in Japan. But yeah, if that's true, that's... I mean, it's one thing inside the movie itself. It's another thing to put it in the advertisement, right? And then she also said that full retard, which is, from the movie, you never go full retard, had been picked up on the school playground and had been used to mock special needs kids, which is unfortunate. So that's there on the other side. The one thing that maybe didn't get a lot of press, or if it did get a lot of press, I didn't see it. There's so much press about the word retard in the use of this movie. And there was some press about the use of blackface in this movie. But then as I'm watching this movie, it just kind of occurred to me as I'm watching it. You know, when I didn't live through the Vietnam War. I was born in 1978. But when I was growing up in the 1980s, I do remember that the subject of the Vietnam War was something that people spoke of with a lot of sadness or reverence. And the traumatic experience of veterans in that war, or the continuing, I'm not sure if the word PTSD was in currency back then, but PTSD it was. The post-traumatic stress syndrome of the veterans who were suffering from this was something that people were talking about it as a serious issue, and it was not something I think you would joke about in the 1980s. Now it's something that's being joked about, and it's a little bit surprising maybe that aspect of the movie didn't get more press at the time. I was kind of halfway through watching the movie before it kind of dawned on me that this was not something that my parents would approve of, certainly had it come out in the 1980s. Now, I know they're not actually making fun of the Vietnam War. They're making fun of Vietnam War movies and the cliches within those movies, you know. But still, it's maybe close enough that it could still be a bit of a tender point. But, you know, maybe in the 1980s, right, late 70s, early 80s, when all these Vietnam War movies were coming out and the nation was in a catharsis, it would have been really inappropriate to do this for comedy. But then maybe now, by the 2000s, enough time has passed. I mean, you know that cliche, right? That with enough time passed, anything becomes target for humor. And maybe we're at that point now. I don't know. I don't really have a strong opinion on it per se. I just thought it was a little bit strange that the aspect of this movie didn't get more press. That people were so concerned about the word retard or the blackface, that the whole idea of kind of mining veterans' traumatic experiences for comedy didn't get more national discussion than it did when this movie came out. Unless I missed something. Like I said, I'd been living in Japan when this came out. But, you know, as far as I could tell on the internet and stuff like that. So, yeah. That's the review, essentially. To come back, I guess, to re-emphasize my main point, I thought it was funny. I guess that's my review in the nutshell. Those other issues are just other issues.